Good morning, church. My name is Pastor Corey. I'm the lead pastor here at Kent Cove. We're glad you're with us. We are continuing this morning in our journey through the Sermon on the Mount, and we're going to pick up where we left off last week in Matthew 6, right at the beginning of the chapter. But we're going to jump around just a little bit, and I'm going to read 1 through 8, and then jump down to 16 to 18. So if you're following along in your Bibles, that's where we are. Jesus says, "Be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of others to be seen by them. If you do, you will have no reward from your Father in heaven. So when you give to the needy, do not announce it with trumpets, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and on the streets to be honored by others. Truly, I tell you, they have received their reward in full. But when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret. Then your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. And when you pray, do not be like the hypocrites, for they love to pray standing in the synagogues and on the street corners to be seen by others. Truly, I tell you, they have received their reward in full. But when you pray, go into your room, close the door, and pray to your Father who is unseen. Then your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. And when you pray, do not keep on babbling like pagans, for they think they will be heard because of their many words. Do not be like them, for your Father knows what you need before you ask Him. When you fast, do not look somber as the hypocrites do, for they disfigure their faces to show others they are fasting. Truly, I tell you, they have received their reward in full. But when you fast, put oil on your head, wash your face, so that it will not be obvious to others that you are fasting, but only to your Father who is unseen. And your Father, who sees what is done in secret, will reward you." Please join me in prayer. Bless us this day, O Lord, with vision. May this place be a sacred place, a telling space where heaven and earth meet. Amen. Motives are tricky. I've been digging into this idea since we covered it some last week, but as we talk about these practices that Jesus holds up, it just has really impressed upon me that motives are really tricky because we have two ways of looking at those things. One, we think that we can understand the motives of those around us, both those whom we love and those whom we don't, or try to love. That's a better way to say it, try to love, right? Because we think we can see, or we think we understand, oh, I know what it is they're after. Or I know what it is that they're trying to do. I know what you're up to. Except for we have this problem, and I talked about it years ago in a sermon. It's called confirmation bias, which basically is a theory that says we see exactly what we look for. And so when we look in our spouse and we have been thinking, well, they're really annoyed with me, and they think I'm going to, X, Y, or Z, right? And then they say something, and all of a sudden there's a whole lot of freight that's put into whatever it was they said, as innocent as it may be, and we've assigned motive to it. And we could be right. In my experience, more often I'm wrong. And we do that with each other as well. We assign motive, and oftentimes that motive confirms our bias. It's tricky. Because there are also times when people have made their motives very clear. And so we're not guessing. That brings up other challenges. The second way that motives are tricky are we're not very good at recognizing our own. Which is the whole point, I think, of what Jesus is teaching us here in this passage. We tend to be much more generous with ourselves and our motives than we are with our neighbors' motives. We also tend to be either willfully or unintentionally unable to see our own motives. And so we are much more generous with ourselves than we are with our neighbors. And so this whole idea of how is it then that we move forward? We'll talk more about that as we go. The other thing that I was thinking about as we think about these practices, and to paraphrase off a novel and a movie that were popular years ago, the theme of this sermon is give, pray, fast. But I struggled with this whole idea because I've been feeling that weight this week, right? Just this sense of, man, I see a lot of things going on in the world, and I don't know what I can do, and I feel powerless, and I don't know what difference, these things make. And in the midst of that, we're reading this text that's talking about giving and praying and fasting, and it feels like something, and yet somehow it doesn't feel like enough. And I was reminded that a few weeks ago, Preacher Preach to Thyself, I talked about the order of the mustard seed. Right? So in the midst of all this overwhelm, in the midst of a world in a culture where there's just so much tension and so many things to be concerned about, what is it that we do? And I talked about this idea of the order of the mustard seed, which came from a and I'm not making this up, it really is his name, a guy from Bavaria, I believe it was, named Count Zinzendorf. And he, back in I think it was in the 1500s, came up with this idea of this order of the mustard seed, and there were basically 3 principles, and this was his encapsulation of how to live out the gospel in that world, and I think he's onto something. The 3 principles were this: be kind to all people. Imagine that. I mean, you want to talk about something that's countercultural in our moment right now? Kindness might be it. Be kind to all people. Number 2, seek their welfare. Be kind to all people, seek their welfare. And then 3rd, win them to Christ. Now, we could go off in a whole different direction here about what it means to win someone to Christ and how it is that we think we have done that, or what the best ways to do that are. But Count Zinzendorf seems to believe that the first 2 steps in winning someone to Christ is to be kind to them and to seek their welfare. Now, lest you think that he's some namby-pamby, pie in the sky kind of guy, you might remember that the prophet Jeremiah, way back when, said to the exiles that they were to settle down and they were to seek the welfare of the city in which they were captives. Or you might go a little less further back and go to Jesus, who says that the whole law is summed up in love God and love your neighbor as yourself. And all of a sudden, I start wondering, okay, that feels like something that somehow has some weight to it. And yet I find myself, and maybe you join me in this spiritual geography, but I find myself both overwhelmed and resigned that there's just nothing I can do. And then that still small voice whispers, well, you can be kind. You can seek the welfare of your neighbors. You can love your neighbors. But how do we find the energy, the courage, the things that we need in this season to do those things? Well, I think there's an answer in our text from this morning. And there's a phrase that gets repeated. There's a couple different phrases that get repeated over and over in these sections, right? But the first is Jesus is making several assumptions. He's actually making 3 assumptions. Now, they're not hidden assumptions. He flat out says what they are. He says, and when you give, and when you pray, and when you fast. Jesus is not hiding his assumption. He's flat out saying that when you do these things, in other words, assuming that we will do them, this is what you need to pay attention to. When you give, and when you pray, and when you fast. Now, we're going to return to prayer next week, but I want to talk more about just this assumption. The assumption that is present is that as followers of Jesus, these 3 things, giving, praying, and fasting, will be a part of our lives. Now, this is not unique, really. Most of the great, if not all, of the great world religions would have some aspect of these 3 things present in them as a practice of their religion. But Jesus asserts that we will do these things. When you give, when you pray, when you fast. But he's very concerned about the motivation behind them. He's very concerned that we don't turn these things into public announcements about our piety. Now, let's start with giving. These 3 things Jesus lays out that he says that we're going to do. One commentator points out that there's these 3 elements to them. They wrote, for to give alms is to seek to serve our neighbor, especially the needy, which seems to be quite out of fashion these days. To pray is to seek God's face and to acknowledge our dependence on him. To fast, that is, to abstain from food for spiritual reasons, is intended at least partly as a way to deny and so to discipline oneself. And Jesus is concerned that we would do these things, but he's also concerned that the why we're doing them is very, very important. He doesn't want us doing them in such a way as to be noticed. Now, giving. The word that's used for giving here is specifically a word that meant almsgiving. It was giving to the needy. And the reality was, in that time, that was the kind of giving that was done because there were no social security, no social welfare safety nets, right? If you were poor and at risk or vulnerable in the first century, you were completely dependent on the almsgiving of your community. The Romans were certainly not concerned with your welfare. They were only concerned with your taxes. And so that's part of what is going on, but it's a very specific word. But Jesus is not just concerned that we would give, he's concerned with how we give. Now, there's a lot of conversation, and you can read, we can read this part of the text, and, he says right at the beginning, when you give to the needy, do not announce it with trumpets, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and on the streets. Now, just to clear something up, I do not believe, nor do most commentators, that there were ever Pharisees who announced their giving with trumpets. I have heard preachers say or suggest that that was literally true. And most commentators agree that this is just like we have in our culture. This was just a turn of phrase describing doing something to be noticed. Right? Now, the corollary, or one of the ways that might look in our world is like go to any college or university campus or hospital or whatever, and go into the, so-and-so wing, right? Or the, whatever it is, hall. So some rich person gave a big gift, and so they wanted it noted, and they put the plaques up, right? I once went into a church, small church, barely alive. There was, I think, less than 20 people left in this congregation in a small town in the Midwest. And as I walked around that building, and this is no kidding, the sanctuary was probably no bigger than this section right here. I counted over 115 plaques with names on them. They were on the pews. They were on the pictures on the wall. They were on the, and I couldn't help but it struck me, right? You're walking around this church that is like dead. But man, those gifts are noted. And maybe they had their reward in full. So when you give to the needy, do not announce it. Here's a challenging thought. One of the ways that I think we need to check our motives is, and I struggle with this myself, especially in a city like when we go into Seattle and there's unhoused folks all over, and some of them are quite aggressive, right? And we start to question, well, I don't give to these people because they'll just use it on whatever. And I wonder if the issue isn't what they'll use it on, but more how we respond to the Jesus in front of us, whether it's appealing to us or not. When you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. And it struck me that, well, maybe my left hand not knowing what my right hand is doing is me not deciding how it is that this is best used or not best used. Maybe the question is for me, where is my heart? Now, recognizing the other challenge is that I never carry cash anymore. Right? So, do you take Venmo? But the question is the same. When we give, what is the motivation of our heart? Are we giving to be noticed? Are we giving so that people know that we're generous, that we're pious, that we're, whatever? Are we giving with conditions on whether or not that person is going to use that money in a way that we personally approve of? But there doesn't seem to be any subtext here from Jesus that any of those are appropriate reasons to not give. And I don't have all the answers. I recognize it's complex. But I think it's worth thinking about. If the left hand is not to know what the right hand is doing and our giving is to be in secret, then how do we do that in a way that is honoring to God, that is seeking the welfare of our neighbor, that honors ourselves in the sense that we are doing it with a heart that is longing to serve God? Now, it does not escape me. I'm a child of the 80s. I can never talk about giving from the pulpit without feeling a little skeezy. Because I grew up in the era of televangelist scandals and all that stuff, right? And yet, for Jesus, It's a theme that he returns to over and over again. Our relationship with money is central to our discipleship. And so we do well to examine our motives and how it is that we are either holding on to or resisting the call that Jesus places here. So when you give to the needy, not if, not according to whatever, but when. Now, prayer, as I said, we're going to spend some time on this next week, and we're going to just real quick tour through the Lord's Prayer. One of the things I just want to note as we're moving through this morning is this idea of hypocrisy in prayer. This is a favorite with a lot of church folk, depending on which tradition you come from. I grew up Lutheran. And so, there's those who take this verse and they say, well, any kind of liturgy is bad because it's just rote and you don't mean what you say and you're not thinking about it and all that kind of stuff. And that certainly can be true. But I've been in evangelical churches long enough to know that we have our own liturgy, and supposed impromptu prayers can follow the same rubrics over and over and over again. So again, let's be careful how we assign motives. And let's remember that we must first look at our own. So we'll come back to that later. Just suffice it to say that Jesus seems to be very clearly saying that prayer is something that is to be done in private, that it shouldn't be just a bunch of words piled on top of each other on the one hand, and it should be thoughtful and seeking to communicate and commune with God, right? But the theme here of this, doing things in secret, and then fasting. Jesus goes on to say, and when you fast. Now, this is one that I will admit is very sporadically a part of my own spiritual journey. Just never has been a discipline that I've pursued. And I think that's generally true. It's one of those places where I remember years ago hearing Tony Campolo talk about different kinds of Christians, and he used to say, you show me the parts of the Bible you believe, and I'll show you the parts you ignore. And I think there are a couple places where Jesus gives very specific instructions that, in general, the church widely ignores. This one, and there's another one, something to do with feet and washing them, right? Now, we can have all kinds of conversation about the cultural, assumptions around that and all of those things. And yet, Jesus says, and when you fast, assuming that we will. So, the question again, though, becomes, when you do it, how do you do it? And he points out that when you do it, you shouldn't alter your appearance or disfigure your face. In other words, walk around like like those Snickers ads, right? Where they're hangry and they turn into something completely different. Or you're just all disheveled and, for the gentleman, unshaven, or whatever it might be. Or you walk around, I'm fasting for the Lord, but I am so hungry. And, right? Jesus says, no, you put oil on your head and wash your face. In other words, take a shower. Get presentable. Go about your business. The point is not to let everybody know that you're doing it. The point is for you to direct your attention to God. And he who sees in secret will reward in secret. All of these things together, it strikes me, are ways for us to be equipped, to be in a place where in the midst of challenging circumstances, we have the energy, the reservoir, the resiliency to be kind to all people, to seek the welfare of our neighbor, and to win them to Christ. Because when we do these things, as Jesus assumes we will, our tanks are being filled, right? And we are being formed more into the image of Jesus. And having that reservoir allows us in uncertain times, in times when perhaps we feel afraid or overwhelmed or whatever it is, or maybe you feel victorious and you think it's the greatest time in history. Either way, if your reservoir isn't full, you're either going to end up demonstrating and doing these things in a way that is not pleasing to God, for which you have your reward. Or if you're not doing them, you're not going to have the reservoir that you need to live in the way of Jesus. Now again, I want you to understand, I stand before you not as one who has perfected or good grief even is very good at some of these. Simply a fellow pilgrim on the journey, recognizing that this is what I need. This is what we need as we seek to be people who pursue joyful wholeness and to love our neighbors. And so we seek to do these things so that God can revive us, so that God can give us what we need in order to be the people that He's calling us to be. I was reminded, too, as I was looking at this whole idea of motivation, of that great story from Victor Hugo, Les Miserables. Most of you are probably familiar with the musical version of the story. I would highly recommend the novel version. You might want to go with the abridged. But it tells the story of Inspector Javert and Jean Valjean. And Inspector Javert is the police inspector, and he's committed to law and order and all of this stuff. But the longer you read the story, you realize that his motivations are all skewed. He's not really motivated by law and order. He's motivated by power and by fear and by all kinds of different things. And then the criminal, Jean Valjean, is motivated. He turns out not to be the kind of criminal that you think, but he's motivated, and he's used as an example of what the resurrection power of Jesus looks like. To take someone who was broken and in prison and to turn them into someone who walks in the way of what I would say is Jesus. One who seeks the welfare of his neighbors, who seeks to do the right thing for the right reasons. So, brothers and sisters, as we go back out into the world this morning, it's my hope for you and for me that we might go, and when we give, and when we pray, and when we fast, we would do so with an eye towards communion with God, with opening our hearts towards Him, allowing Him to form us, to challenge us, to turn us into people who live in the way of Jesus, who seek to be kind to their neighbors and seek their welfare. And maybe, just maybe by doing so, we will see them come home to Christ. Amen.